introduce our speakers. We have with us Des Hobson, who has been lead ecologist at Swindon Borough Council for over 6 years, and before that had a long and successful career working with other local authorities and in consultancy. And Des is going to be speaking about an exciting example BNG project from Swindon. We're also joined by Rachel Jones, who is Ecology Manager at Wiltshire Council. Rachel has also held senior advisory roles with Natural England and with LPAs. And Rachel's going to be joining the panel for the Q&A. We also have with us Dr. Sophus Tu Erngassen. Sophus is an ecological economist based at the University of Oxford. He advises Natural England on the monitoring and evaluation of BNG and the UK Treasury on biodiversity economics. And he coordinates work at Oxford's Nature Positive Hub, researching the implementation of BNG. Sophus will be summarising some of their team's latest research on BNG best practice. And we'll also have speaking two of my colleagues at Verna. So Dr. Michael Thorpe is our Director of Ecology. He has more than 2 decades of experience, including work across the whole of the UK, from restoring heathland in Dorset to peatland in Scotland. And also Rafi Cohen, my co-CEO at Verna. Before Rafi and I founded Verna together, he helped lead the climate and environment team for KPMG in the UK, and previously led environmental data work at Boston Consulting Group and a major climate non-profit. And Michael and Rafi will be speaking about Verna's research on BNG implementation and particularly monitoring. They'll also give a very brief overview of the Mycelia software program that Verna is building to help local authorities with BNG. So moving on to the agenda slide. This slide just essentially summarises what I've just said about what the speakers will be focusing on, just to emphasise here that this agenda and these areas of focus have been determined by the preferences that all of you shared when you signed up. So thank you very much for that engagement and input. It's been really helpful to make sure that we focus this webinar on the right things. So let's get started. I'll hand over in a second to Rafi as the first speaker. Just before I do that, a quick reminder again to submit questions at any time using the Q&A button in Teams, and I'll make sure that the most popular questions get answered at the end. So over to you, Rafi.
Great, thank you for that, Matthew. So I think just to start off, everyone on this webinar will know already that the natural world is under threat. But it's important to remind ourselves, I think, of the general context around this. So first, if this trend continues, people will suffer significantly. Food security will be impacted, water and air quality similarly, and just general quality of life. And society is increasingly waking up to this fact. A number of you might know that the financial services industry is not known for its credentials around environment and sustainability, but companies like Zurich Insurance, as you can see here, are starting to realise and say very clearly that biodiversity loss is a very significant problem. But it's also local. Even within this general context, as you can see, there's been a 69% decrease in wildlife populations globally between 1970 and 2018. That's global. On a local level, the Natural History Museum a couple of years ago showed that the UK, even within that context, is one of the world's most depleted countries in terms of biodiversity. We're in the bottom 10%, and England is rated the worst across the 4 nations. So we've got a lot to do. But in this context, it's exciting actually that BNG is happening here and that the rest of the world is watching us and looking to learn. As you can see here, in a recent major study by the Harvard Kennedy School and the Environmental Policy Innovation Centre in Washington, DC, they said that biodiversity net gain in England is the most important nature policy in the world right now. Essentially, if BNG is successful in England, others will follow. But if it's not successful, this will impact the global agenda. So there's no pressure on us. And I call this out because it's often difficult to remember when you're on row 14 of tab 7, assessing your 3rd metric of the day, that what you're doing and what we're doing is all part of this big global movement that potentially can have a lot of positive impact. So the success of BNG is important for driving better environmental outcomes, both locally and potentially across many countries beyond England and the UK. And to achieve this, effective monitoring is essential. It's not everything, but it's absolutely essential. And this is the case because of basic incentives in the system. So within B&G, action needs to be taken on the ground, which will cost organisations time and money. And so inevitably, organisations will look for shortcuts if there's no counterbalance. And the counterbalance in this context is proactive monitoring by LPAs. Essentially, without effective monitoring, B&G is likely to be just a box ticking exercise. And this is a conclusion supported by academic research, and we'll hear a bit more about that later in the webinar, including from Sophus. But before we dig into this further, we appreciate that everyone's at a different stage of maturity in their preparations. So I'll hand over to Des to give an example of the type of work that LPAs are doing around B&G.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Des Hobson. I'm the ecologist at Swindon Borough Council, which is a unitary authority in North Wiltshire. This case study is for the redevelopment of the Honda car plant in Swindon, which closed in 2021. The site includes large areas of broadleaved woodland, which was planted around the perimeter when the car plant opened, a big area of species poor grassland on the east of the site with breeding skylark, and an existing attenuation lake with reed beds, which is also occasionally used by otters. GCN were recorded, as well as a good bat assemblage along the eastern side, particularly near the lake. The ecologists for this application were Middlemarch Environmental, who were excellent. The developers Panattoni will be building 8 enormous distribution centres on the site. There was to be a 9th distribution centre on top of the lake, which is the area of highest ecological value. In order to achieve some BNG, the developers will be opening up a culverted watercourse which runs east-west across the middle of the site, as well as enhancing the perimeter woodland, although 15% of the woodland will be removed. Panattoni refused to consider biodiverse green roofs on the distribution centres, which would have been great compensation for impacts on ground nesting birds. So in the end, as part of the planning balance, we accepted a £5.5 million biodiversity offsetting payment payable to Swindon Borough Council to compensate for 251 biodiversity units, which includes 10% biodiversity net gain based on the baseline of the site. Next slide, please. However, before we got there, we had nearly 900 documents submitted with the application to review, including a large number which relate to ecology. As you can imagine, the biodiversity metric and supporting habitat maps were very complex for this large site. We also needed to have confidence that the biodiversity predictions made can and will be achieved. Each of my 2 document reviews took me about a week. In particular, I needed to ensure that none of the documents contradicted another. So, for example, some plans initially showed only partial deculverting of the watercourse, so we needed to be sure we knew what we were agreeing to. Without GIS, it is hard to relate the habitat areas in the metric to the plans in UK HABs. I'm hoping to change the Council's validation requirements so we also get the mapping data as shapefiles, which will help and then can be added to our GIS. I always ask for a landscape, ecological and arboricultural management plan, LEAMP, in support of the metric prior to determination, so I can be confident that the biodiversity predictions made are likely to be achieved. Applicants will often push back and say that they will only provide the LEAMP if it is conditioned with a planning approval. They justify this by referring to the 2013 British Standard Biodiversity Code of Practice for Planning and Development, which says that LEAMPs should be secured by planning condition. However, if a LEAMP is provided post-determination, then local planning authorities do not get the reassurance they need that the predictions for net gain can be achieved. Next slide, please. During the process, we secured improvements to the new watercourse, which will be opened up across the whole width of the site. The applicant's ecologist Middlemarch worked with us on this. Initially, the new watercourse, which is shown in this image, a bit of it shown in this image, was to be a largely straight ditch. We got the green corridor widened, with some meanders and pools and riffles added to the stream. We moved lighting off the overbridges so the green corridor will be better for nocturnal wildlife, and got box culverts with otter ledges underneath the road crossings rather than round pipes. However, the stream design isn't perfect yet, so we have applied a planning condition so we could get the design a bit better. Next slide, please. Achieving BNG does add significant time and complexity to planning casework, but it is definitely worth it. The metric needs to be assessed in conjunction with the landscape, ecological and arboricultural management plan, and needs to be supported by a robust habitat management and monitoring plan, which Middlemarch provided us with this application. The habitat management and monitoring plan needs to contain milestones, describe target conditions and contain review points. The LPA needs to have confidence that monitoring and review will take place, as this can so often disappear into the long grass as soon as the development is completed. Applying a condition requiring a copy of the monitoring and review document to go to the LPA at each review may be one way of ensuring that reviews do happen. It is vital, therefore, that the LPA has the technical expertise and processes in place to track and monitor projects, and that it also has the teeth to be able to take enforcement action if necessary. However, enforcement can only take place if the management and monitoring plan was robust enough in the first place. Over to Michael.
Thank you, Des. Good morning, everyone. So as Rafa said earlier, for BNG to work, appropriate monitoring is needed. Before I go into this slide, it might be useful to distinguish between the two types of monitoring we're talking about today. The first one is direct monitoring, which is the detailed site-based survey of habitats to assess their development and inform any decision to change habitat management measures. The other one is indirect monitoring, which is the tracking of BNG schemes by LPAs. So this includes compiling and reviewing information sent to the LPA, but can also include site checks, which should not be confused with the direct monitoring surveys. They're just inspections really to gain an overview of what's happening on site. So the focus here right now is on indirect monitoring, although I will later describe LPA's stated requirements for direct monitoring as well. So managing the data for a single monitoring site for over 30 years will be challenging. While managing the data for hundreds or thousands of schemes will be very difficult. So our analysis suggests that even a small LPA covering about 300 applications relevant to BNG could be monitoring up to 3,000 sites within 5 years. Monitoring requires two things: technical expertise and effective process. Each of its own is insufficient, and both are necessary to drive better outcomes. So in terms of the technical expertise, the local government ecologist must have sufficient knowledge to be able to review information critically. So this requires good knowledge of local regional habitats and preferably also of rare and protected fauna. The local government ecologist must know about survey best practice so they can assess if works are done to an appropriate standard. They must be able to assess when habitat trajectory is on track and when it is not. And they must have sufficient experience to assess if the proposed adaptive management measures are appropriate and be able to identify better alternatives where they are not. Monitoring also requires a well thought through, future-proof and resilient process. And this requires collaboration, typically with multiple colleagues needing to work together. It requires clarity, each colleague needing to know what his or her responsibilities are, and it must include resilience. For example, the process cannot depend on individuals, as annual leave, sickness, and staff turnover must not get in the way. And finally, efficient processing and saving of data is obviously needed for keeping track of thousands of BNG schemes over many years. Next slide, please. So what are the national requirements for BNG monitoring? We are still awaiting secondary legislation and associated guidance on this, but a broad outline is available. So the DEFRA BNG consultation response in February described habitat monitoring as being the responsibility of the developer, and that monitoring should be set out in the Biodiversity Gain plan. The planning authorities should set specific and proportionate monitoring requirements as part of planning conditions and obligations used to secure offsite or significant on-site habitat enhancements. Now, the legislation does not define significant in this context, but as we understand it, DEFRA are currently minded to set a definition according to habitat area and distinctiveness. The response also said that as a minimum, monitoring reports should include a summary of habitat type, extent, and their condition, and that monitoring reports might be expected in years 2, 5, 10, 20, and 30 for a typical site. It's useful to also consider the enhanced biodiversity duty under the NERG Act. It outlines what needs to be included in reporting to central government, which in turn may be informed by monitoring data. So a summary of the actions the LPA has carried out to meet BNG obligations in the last period, details of biodiversity gains resulting or expected to result from biodiversity gain plans that have been approved, and a summary of how the LPA plans to meet biodiversity net gain obligations in the next reporting period. So all those things will be affected by your monitoring on site. Next slide, please. So what do LPAs say about direct monitoring requirements? As part of the research we've done with over 40 LPAs over the past year, we've recently carried out a review of BNG monitoring guidance published by LPAs, both relating to on-site and off-site BNG. And it's clear from this research that LPAs are still very much on a journey around putting technical expertise and effective process in place. And to date, only a small minority of LPAs have any actual wording on monitoring. So we looked at the guidance from 28 LPAs. We were mainly interested in 6 topics, including the 3 shown here. So in terms of the length of the monitoring period, as you know, an individual BNG scheme goes on for at least 30 years, and most LPAs ask for monitoring over this whole period. However, some LPAs do say that monitoring can end when the target condition of a given habitat has been reached. And there is no stated difference in the length of the monitoring period for on-site and off-site gains. How frequently should a site be monitored? Well, some LPAs have very prescribed monitoring schedules, but others simply ask the applicant to propose this, or they don't mention it at all. The most common requirement is monitoring and the associated reporting to the LPA in years 2, 3, 5 after the initial habitat establishment, and then every 5 years thereafter. And again, the requirement is similar for on-site and off-site gains. Which of the habitat features should be monitored? Well, most of the LPAs in our sample require all habitats used in BNG calculations to be monitored, but some state that only significant habitats need to be included. In this context, they define significant habitats as being those of medium or higher distinctiveness. In one case, the guidance states that only significant habitat needs monitoring on-site, whereas all off-site habitats used in BNG calculations need monitoring. Next slide, please. We were also interested in what data to capture in the direct monitoring, who is responsible for the monitoring, and how it should be funded. So what needs to be recorded? Well, where this is prescribed, most LPAs request that habitat types and condition are recorded. A few LPAs spell out that biodiversity units need to be captured. There is no stated difference in on-site versus off-site data capture. Who is responsible? Well, LPA guidance generally states that responsibilities must be clearly defined in the planning application. So the onus is on the applicant to propose this. The landowner or developer is responsible for appointing suitably qualified ecologists to do the actual direct monitoring. But where the LPA runs an offset or the habitat bank is being used, habitats would be monitored by the operators. Monitoring reports must be sent to the LPA so they can track the overall progress of BNG schemes. How will LPA's monitoring activities over 30+ years be funded? This is very rarely spelled out, but some do request a specific charge, for example, £2,000 per biodiversity unit. And this is irrespective of whether or not the monitoring is on-site or off-site. So DEFRA are still in the process of drafting a number of statutory instruments ahead of BNG becoming mandatory in November. These include, but are not restricted to, the ones shown here. So exemptions, the types of development that would be exempt from mandatory BNG, which habitats should be considered as irreplaceable for BNG purposes and therefore are subject to bespoke compensation, how the offsite register will work and what will be mandated, the planning system, how BNG will work through the planning process, including approval of biodiversity gains and the process for phased developments. And finally, the commencement regulations that switch off on the provisions of the Environment Act for the implementation date and set out certain transitional arrangements. And with that, I hand over to Sophus.
Thanks so much. Hi, everyone. Yeah, my name is Sophus. I'm a postdoctoral ecological economist based at the University of Oxford. And for about the last 3 years, I've been investigating and trying to understand the outcomes of biodiversity net gain in a series of earlier adopter councils. So for the last 3 years or so, we've been building this data set of biodiversity net gain assessments from a sample of 6 early adopter councils. Now, bearing in mind, the caveat here is that 6 is not very many local authorities, right? So this is the best data that we have that is available to work with at the moment. But we hope it's a fairly good proxy for what's happening across the country as a whole. And in short, we've been collecting all of the developments that have happened in these councils over the last 3 years, and we've been doing analysis on this so far. And one of the really interesting findings is that there are some really severe implementation issues in BNG so far. And so in our sample, 24% of the submitted biodiversity net gain metric calculations included very easy to spot aggregation errors. So essentially the areas of the site before and after didn't add up. And what we think, local authorities are doing the best they can with the limited resources that are available. But we think this is a sign that there is a serious amount of capacity constraints within local authorities and a lot of work that needs to be done in order to better organize information and allow local authorities to better process information and implement biodiversity net gain more robustly. And so we had 24% of metric calculations that included errors. Of these, 40% of metrics with errors included large errors, where the differences in area between the baseline and post-development scenarios were more than 10% in size. And more than half of these projects had already been accepted by local authorities. So evidence that there are some serious implementation issues that need ironing out. Next slide, please. So when you take all of the developments in our data set, this is essentially what it looks like. So this is a bubble chart that shows how different developments are achieving their biodiversity net gain outcomes. Essentially, everything north of the x-axis is associated with urban land take, and everything south of the x-axis is net restoring natural habitats. Everything to the left of the y-axis are developments that are not able to meet their liabilities on site and so need to buy offsets. Everything right of the x-axis is able to achieve at least no net loss on site. And essentially, the main takeaway finding here is that in our sample, smaller developments will largely be buying offsets, but large developments, which are super consequential for the outcomes of the policy, and are delivering the vast majority or all of their net gain liabilities on site. These will require really strict monitoring and enforcement because they're currently, as it stands, these gains are not going to be registered in Natural England's offsite register, and we need to understand what is happening within these large developments. It's really important and consequential for the outcomes of the policy as a whole. Next slide, please. So we've been doing some work to understand how exposed biodiversity net gain as currently implemented is to governance risks, to the risks of non-compliance. And in short, our most recent estimates from this data set suggest that 27% of all of the biodiversity units in the policy are habitats that will be delivered on site of condition levels that are reasonably high that currently are going to be really hard to enforce, to monitor and enforce under the current planning system. And so any way that we can better organize the information to better structure monitoring and enforcement of these on-site habitats will be extremely consequential for the biodiversity outcomes of the policy as a whole. Thanks very much.
Great, thank you for that, Sophus. So There are a couple of key points I'd really like to share with you in terms of effective monitoring process. But before I do, I'd like to share some other points first to bring everything we've heard together. So Michael outlined earlier that both technical expertise and effective process are key for the success of B&G. Most LPAs have access to at least some technical expertise, but our research suggests that it's difficult to put in place an effective process around B&G for a couple of reasons. So there's lots of types of data that are required for each case or site, geospatial information, multiple versions of the metric, PDF reports, etc. Second, you need to be able to capture historical and forward-looking information, and that needs to be over decades of time. Collaboration's required between different people within the LPA and outside of the LPA as well, and that creates a whole load of complexity. And you need to be able to do this for thousands of sites. Michael mentioned that even for a very small LPA, you'll be dealing with 3,000 sites within a couple of years. So it's difficult, but it is also essential, like we heard from Sophos, for example, about how good governance process are absolutely key for success. So we think there are 5 activities that are essential for LPAs to put in place for an effective process. First of all, data needs to be captured, and this needs to be multiple types of data, like I mentioned a minute ago. There needs to be an audit trail of who's added what information when, and information needs to be added in a consistent way by multiple people over a long period of time. The data needs to be contextualized, and by that I mean all this data needs to be linked to a case and then monitoring sites, again, over a 30-year journey. The information needs to be accessible and clear, and also tell the story of what's going on. The information needs to then be matched to practical requirements, so it's necessary to specify, for example, what needs to be done in the next period of time. That might be a few weeks, a few months, and this might be specific reports that need to be received and reviewed, or site visits that are required. And these actions then need to be able to be split between colleagues, and also it needs to be possible to track that these actions have been done. Fourth, it's important that that information can then be presented to others to engage. So that's within your own team, but then also other internal stakeholders like heads of service or councillors, the public, of course, and statutory reporting to central government. And ultimately, and finally, monitoring findings need to shape subsequent actions. So we need to be action oriented with all of this process, and that might be a decision of whether habitat targets are on track to be met, and if they're not, then obviously a plan for adaptive management is needed. So there are a number of challenges when it comes to putting in place an effective monitoring process, and we've set about trying to solve these problems and others in a tool that we call Mycelia.